Okay, we are live. Welcome to TradeView, TradeView Live, let's say episode 8. I've lost count at this point. Um, but we are continuing our twice per month, every 2 week cadence for 30 minutes. I'm your host, Ben Tracy. I lead strategic business development at Vizion, joined here by our CEO and co-founder, Kyle Henderson. So Kyle, before we talk about what is TradeView Live, can you explain to the audience what is TradeView?
Sure thing, Ben. So TradeView is a product, both a SaaS app and a data product that Vizion has brought to market. And at a high level, it pulls in data from many different data sources. But one of the key data sources is getting access to about 57% of all global ocean bookings on a daily basis. From our perspective, that's 3 times more than anyone else out there. And we're one of the only, if not the only providers we know of that can actually see bookings from the time of booking. And that means we have a forward-looking information about what's going to happen in the market. And we profile this information across 1.5 million companies, give 90-day trade forecasts, build supplier and product networks, value chains get mapped out, and even built out an AI researcher on top of all this data to answer pressing business questions that you might have.
Wonderful. TradeView Live, just so you all know, this is a 30-minute discussion about relevant topics going on in the world of supply chain, in container shipping. We're also here to demonstrate how the TradeView platform can help answer or add insight or commentary to some of these issues. So it's both a thoughtful discussion, a demonstration, live insights. But why don't we add a little bit more color to what you're describing here, Kyle, about TradeView? Where does all of this data come from?
Yeah, so we've done the hard work over the past 5 years to connect to 270 plus data sources. That's many different ocean carriers, NVOCCs, rail carriers, trucking carriers, AIS data providers for tracking of vessels, both terrestrial and satellite and imagery, information from customs, building out locations, data sets, geofences, all a long list of different data sources to be able to get more intelligence about what is happening, and also more intelligence about what's going to happen. We get this question a lot, Ben, when we talk about the data sources. You know, it's great that you have all this data, but how can you help me figure out what's going to happen? And some of our data helps do that specifically. So again, one of our key data sets is oceans bookings. So we see the booking at the time it's placed, how it's managed through this process, getting amended, potentially getting canceled, et cetera. And then we actively track it all the way through to its delivery and provide performance information, provide auditing information, provide any kind of insights that could be related to the companies involved with that shipment, the products involved with that shipment, and also the performance/risks around that shipment.
Great. So why don't we catch up the audience as to what's happened in the last 2 weeks? We typically take a look at shipping demand as far as bookings being entered that the TradeView platform sources. We have a few key regions here, a lot that's happened, of course, in terms of U.S. trade policy over the last couple of months, and then even some critical updates in the last 2 weeks. So how have we seen that shown in the numbers, Kyle?
Yeah, so probably the biggest things to call out, and generally speaking, has been year-over-year changes. So in the top, we don't really see that much in terms of week-over-week or year-over-year changes when we look at global bookings, this top chart. We know year-over-year down 1.4%, week-over-week down 0.7%. It seems relatively stable, a little up last week with 3.8 and 4.8 respectively, week-over-week or year-over-year. But when we focus on just bookings that will be imports into the United States, the US import bookings, year-over-year change pretty meaningful this past week. It dropped 11.5%. And so that's from any country to the United States. And then more specifically from China to the United States, we saw an even bigger change. So last week it was down 16.3% year over year. This week it's down 21. Sorry, 2 weeks ago. Now it's down 21.7% year over year. So while some of the volume has returned to the China to US relationship, it also appears that year over year, and even a little week over week, it hasn't quite come back to what it may have used to be, or you would typically be expecting this year. But this does start to beg some questions, right? Because like year over year, was last year a normal year? It's tough to say that any of the past 5 years have been normal years.
Right. Last year we saw an early peak season.
Yes.
So most impactful for China to US, but I think this also impacted all of US import bookings.
And
so
2023 was kind of a soft year
Exactly.
in general, following the bullwhip effect of all the COVID ordering still. Freight volumes were down, freight rates were down. So I think this is maybe begging this next slide a little bit, Ben, but perhaps we need to do a deeper dive on this topic and just this question, and maybe this is the next TradeView Live or maybe a blog post we put out, but is there any seasonality anymore in ocean freight? I feel like we need to look on this like on a 10-year time frame. But if we just look at global ocean bookings, 2023 and 2025, each year broken out as a different line, with 23 being green, 24 being gold, and 25 being blue, you can see potentially what was last year gold being the early peak season, right? You have this climbing up in late April, beginning of May. You have the drop at the very beginning of May due to International Workers' Day. And then you have another big chunk. This year, it kind of followed the opposite, but we have the tariffs drop off here with this decline. And then we have the bounce back from the tariffs. And then we have kind of getting back to baseline. It kind of begs the question of where is peak season? Right. Was this an early peak season? Is peak season not happening yet? Did so much front loading happen that inventories are okay-ish? I know that consumer sentiment's looking up a bit more in Europe, et cetera. US is still going pretty strong. A lot of political pressure on dropping interest rates. So I'm not sure what is normal now.
Yeah, and I think would be interesting is, so global bookings, we don't see this big variation other than in the weeks just following Liberation Day, when clearly 2024 in comparison to 2025 is showing a pretty significant lower number in comparison to the year before. But other than that, the lines look very similar, 2024 to 2025. For US imports, though, I think this is where we might see more of a variation in the pattern. And specifically in the most recent weeks, what we have seen is this decline, which is quite a departure from the year before. What we saw in 2023 was maybe a more typical peak season. You see this climb upwards into week 29, week 30 approximately. What we saw in 2024 was an early peak season, but still a relatively high weekly volume, well above 400,000 TEUs booked per week. We are well below that right now. We are going down below 375,000 TEUs booked per week. And potentially we're going to decline now even below the 2023 peak season volumes. So that's just an important statistic to watch. We saw this surge following the temporary reprieve in the tariffs. We have a lot that's going to happen in the next 9 days, potentially additional tariffs that will be levied on many different countries all at once. Certain countries like Canada, Japan, and India, I think are of note. We're still lacking finite details about the China and US trade deal. And so all of that, I think, contributes to this US import decline that we've seen in the last 2 weeks, and especially decline that in comparison to the year before looks like we're going well below year-over-year numbers.
I'd also say on this topic of seasonality, Ben, so this dip, which is International Workers' Day, right? You just don't have as many bookings happening that week. But if you kind of normalize it out, you see that last year, okay, well, we should be kind of seeing a trend over a dozen weeks or so right here at about this level,
right?
Which is that early peak season you're talking about. Compared to 2023, when peak season didn't really start hitting until week 26, 27, et cetera. It's just unclear.
Yeah.
Is peak season even happening now? Was it baked into front loading in some way? Just don't know. But maybe this next slide gives us a bit more clarity when it's just China to the US.
Yeah.
Again, you have this kind of level where if you normalize labor week, you should be seeing a golden kind of trend for these weeks. I'm scrolling over, be about here. But again, the peak season was much later in 2023, and who knows what's happening in 2025.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting the point we're at right now, which is that we are 20% below 2024 numbers, and we are equal to 2023 numbers. But we are equal in a sense of we are on the way down, and at this point in 2023, the numbers were on the way up. So it's very possible right now we are entering a period where China to US bookings will see lows that we haven't seen in 2 years when you compare specifically this time of year.
Yeah. And getting into some of those detailed numbers, we're looking at all arrivals into the US and then arrivals specifically into US LAX for this most recent weeks we're sharing, June 16 through 22. I think this is sharing a little bit about the accuracy of our predictions around these arrivals. So we have a number of numbers here for the weeks. We have our planned TEU arrivals, which is this first column, which is all the bookings we see with their estimated delivery dates. We then have used our historical information and recent trending information and built out a prediction model that says, okay, what are the gap between what we see in bookings and what we think will be arriving, which then leads to our sum of these two, which is the Vizion forecasted total TEU volume we're expecting to arrive in the US and LAX. And we had these forecasts here, and then we put down the actuals next to it. So you can see we are very, very, very close to the target. And we're looking at these weeks in advance and being able to anticipate. So like what we're seeing also right now, and this gets to be an interesting topic with seasonality, is we can start sharing some predictions soon about if we think that decline that you're talking about here, Ben, this blue line dropping, is it still look like it's dropping over the next few weeks? Right. Or is it going to flatten? Is it going to bounce back up? We'll start sharing some insights on our blog soon around that.
And specifically arrivals into the US, but in particular arrivals into LAX, into Long Beach. I've seen reporting that in recent weeks, the arrivals began to creep upward because of that surge in bookings that was 5-6 weeks ago. But as we see, that's been on the decline. So what we would expect is that arrivals, especially into LAX, which mostly is receiving freight from China, that those arrivals are going to start going down pretty dramatically over the next 6 weeks. So more to come from our forecast. And yeah, this summarizes it pretty well, just how close we are to the actual total reported by CBP.
98% accurate this first week of June, 88.6 the second week, and 96.8% accurate the third week in June. So we have a pretty detailed look of what's coming into the US ahead of schedule. And then similar story for US LAX, 92, 87, 91. We're in this upper 80s, low 90s level of accuracy for forecasting in great detail how many TUs are going to be showing up per week.
And we've had customers ask about the Port of Houston, Savannah, Long Beach. So just keep in mind, we've got all the ports available here, 26 in total per this slide, not just US imports and LAX. Those are more just the ones we've selected for these slides. Yeah, here's a list of all the different ports, port codes that we have available for forecasted arrivals looking ahead over the next 6 weeks.
Screenshot that.
Yep.
All right, back onto the topic of the Strait of Hormuz.
Oh, real quick, Kyle, just before we jump into the Strait of Hormuz, because I do want to address this question about planned versus predicted and forecasted. So there was a question from Chris here in the chat. Planned, is that the actual bookings that Vizion has seen or will see arrive? And the answer is yes, you're understanding this correctly. Planned is what we have in the booking transaction that is on the water with a scheduled arrival. Predicted is modeling that to what we think the total will be. And then actual is comparing to what the reported total was from CBP.
So we
And
add
then
planned and predicted together, and that's our total. And then we look at it compared to actual.
there's a second question, which is what would account for the difference between the predicted and the actual? So there's a very small difference here, a couple of percentage points, but could it be that the carriers are rolling bookings? Could it be a canceled booking? Because these are shipments that are on the water, I don't think any canceled or rolled bookings would affect this number. I think this is more that the ETA for the arrivals have actually been pushed out by potentially a week or a couple of days. So what we predicted hasn't arrived yet, but likely was pushed to the next week.
Yeah, delayed in the process. Because we typically see with these service strings, primarily when it's serving US LAX and especially from East Asia origins, if you miss your ship, your vessel, it's typically a week of time before the next vessel comes around to pick you up.
But rolled bookings, canceled bookings are statistics we measure. That would be more of an impact at an origin port rather than arrivals into a destination port. But for example, canceled bookings or these shipments were estimated to depart from China, but we did not see them depart. Those would be indications of delays, rolled bookings, or cancellations that are more at the origin level.
There's also a slightly interesting element to look here as well about what future performance might hold, because we keep a stat on transshipment dwell times.
Yeah.
And so understanding how essentially much buildup is happening at major transshipment points can also help us better understand why destination numbers might be changing versus what performa or schedule was as well.
Exactly.
So some additional, and we recalculate the transshipment dwell times on a daily basis as well as origin and destination port performance. And when we say port performance, we're not just talking about what the ports or the transshipment ports do about the vessels. We're also saying, in addition to the vessels, how are the containers being processed?
Yep.
So this is what we heard is much more meaningful insights to many of our customers, because they love knowing when the vessel arrived, but they really care about when can I get my box out.
We had an additional question about how we're doing forecasts. The question again from Chris, thank you. Are your forecasts done at the level of a trade lane or at a regional level? The answer is all of those are possibilities. Right now, what we're demonstrating is just our forecast into LAX or into the US, irrespective of origin. So this would include China as the origin. This would include shipments from any origin coming into the US or coming into LAX. Of course, arrivals into LAX, the majority are coming from China specifically, but we do have the ability to forecast specifically for a trade lane. So let's say China to US for a port pair, or to group a region to, let's say, arrivals into the entire west coast of the United States. That can be done at a regional level as well.
Port pairing is also, you mentioned it, but I want to double down on that, a very, very meaningful, valuable one as well, because this gives a far more detail. And plus in TradeView, you don't just have to look at forecasts based upon, say, the dimension of locations. You can have locations, but you can add additional dimension, be like, well, only these types of products, or only these types of companies in this industry, or only these specific companies being listed as buyers or suppliers. The question then will become, though, is what are we doing to measure our actual? And so we can then communicate our accuracy. Yep. And so we get into these types of conversations with different customers who share some of their data with us about, okay, well, here are my total actual shipments. Now help me better understand that predicted gap between what you saw with planned and what the actual was.
Yeah. Lots of potential modeling, lots of potential forecasts and predictions. With the time that we have left, I know we wanted to spend a little bit of time on the Strait of Hormuz. I just want to add some qualifiers to this, that a couple of weeks ago, maybe even just 1 week ago, this was a much bigger story than it might appear today, because the ceasefire between Israel and Iran seems to be holding for now. But I think it's an important demonstration of a specific zone or geofence being able to highlight not just an individual country, not just an individual port, but in this case, an entire waterway and all the shipments traveling through it from an import or an export perspective. and what shipping behavior might be responding to a crisis, to a supply chain disruption like the one that was being discussed last week.
Yeah. So this is the stats looking back over the past 2.5 years or so for anything that is an inbound into ports inside the Strait of Hormuz. I think there was one port that was slightly outside of the Strait of Hormuz, but it is extremely close to it. So we included that as well, just because of potential threat that it might receive. But as we can see here, bookings really haven't changed much. Nothing is that much of an outlier in terms of bookings into ports beyond the Strait of Hormuz. And you can break this down to even greater detail. I mean, we're looking at year-over-year, week-over-week change, 5%, 8.2 for year-over-year. Pretty meaningful change, like week of 25, week-over-week change, but nothing too crazy, especially when we're talking about these types of volumes, right? They're not that many containers of difference. Now for export bookings, similar story, but you can see all of the lines fluctuate a bit more, and they don't seem to necessarily fluctuate consistently, other than they're fluctuating up and down. They're not really in sync with one another, but you can also say like none of them actually appear to be off in terms of total volumes that much. Now, the year-over-year change, like week 25 was 113%, 27%, etc. But again, we're talking about pretty small numbers when it comes to containers leaving the Strait of Hormuz. But unlike what we saw in April with U.S. tariffs, there's not like a cliff. People didn't all of a sudden just stop booking anything out of the Strait of Hormuz or into the Strait of Hormuz. That was not the story.
Agreed. And yes, so sort of pivoting away from the Strait of Hormuz, a couple of weeks ago, we looked at bookings for specific products that might be more sensitive to tariffs. So this looks at specifically the HS code for chemicals, all shipments going into the US weekly bookings.
And year over year, pretty meaningfully low numbers the past 4 weeks.
Yeah.
Ranging from 10 to 28% down year over year.
And that's been pretty consistent now 4 weeks in a row.
Additionally, plastics, which can be kind of in a similar category as organic chemicals, also seeing some depressed rates year over year, comparatively speaking. This is interesting, the beginning of the year, a massive amount of front loading comparatively.
Yeah,
right. And even looking at the previous one, there was some front loading, but not at the same kind of consistent level as with plastics.
Yep.
And then toys, sporting goods, etc., global to us, pretty.
I think this HS code in particular, whether it's related to back to school, peak season, a lot of holiday goods, Black Friday sales. Again, those are typically brought in between the months of July and August. Last year, it was a little bit earlier. And so when we talk about the peak season that happened earlier last year in comparison to this year, we seem quite a bit down year over year. We're seeing that most pronounced in this HS code for toys, retail products, sporting goods. We are just significantly down year over year.
We get the front loading here, right?
Yes.
And then we get the tariff cliff here.
Yep.
And then, but it doesn't quite bounce back in the same way as you said. It was last year, the peak season came early. So maybe this is normal, depending. We don't have a 2023 or maybe a 2019 comparison would be better, but not quite the usual. This gets back to that question of like, what are the seasons nowadays? When do these seasons actually happen?
And I think my interest is, depending on what's announced in the next, week, 8 days, are we going to see a particular product category like this drop even further based on potentially 25, 30%, somewhere in that range, tariffs that are being advertised that might be imposed on countries like Vietnam, India, that we import a lot of these goods from?
Well, we got just a few minutes left here. Feel free to drop any questions into the comment chain here in LinkedIn. Any closing notes you wanted to share, Ben?
No, I just think there's similar to where we were 2 weeks ago. There's a lot that's going to happen between now and the next time we meet. In particular, pay attention to some of those details on the China to U.S. Trade policy, but also countries like Japan, India, and then just potentially a blanket tariff that's applied to many countries at once. We'll see how that impacts the potential bookings, and in particular, comparing it on a 2-year scale, not just comparing it to that early peak season we saw last year, but are we now even below 2023 numbers as well?
And a bit of a preview of topics coming perhaps for next TradeView Live. No promises right now, but we're looking to do some top movers when it comes to ports worldwide in terms of market share. But I think potentially more interesting is port performance top movers in recent history. So like, where are the ports and potentially even which terminals, which we've seen some pretty meaningful fluctuations in terms of their performance, both vessel processing, container processing, and also doing meaningful enough volume that these are meaningful changes in their performance. So looking to have a bit more focus on ports the next TradeView Live.
Wonderful. Well, thank you all for attending. Thank you for the questions, both during this chat and then all the feedback we get after these presentations. We'll see you all again in 2 weeks.
Thank you all.
See ya.